The contents of Sarah Martinez's safety deposit box revealed she wasn't just a struggling single mother. Running an $800 auto repair shop in small-town Ohio, she was Colonel Sarah Elena Vasquez, a decorated military intelligence officer who had been operating a classified Pentagon command center beneath her garage while single-handedly coordinating counterterrorism operations across 3 continents. The revelation would shatter the quiet industrial town of Millfield, Ohio, population 3,400, and expose a story of sacrifice, deception, and heroism that redefined what it means to serve your country while protecting the people you love most. Before we jump into this incredible story, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this revelation shocks you as much as it shocked us. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something even more extraordinary for you. Sarah Martinez had been a fixture in Millfield since the summer of 2018, arriving on a sweltering July afternoon with nothing but a beat-up 2004 Honda Civic, loaded with garbage bags full of clothes, 2 scared 8-year-old twin daughters clutching stuffed animals, and exactly $847 in cash, just enough to put a down payment on Miller's abandoned auto repair shop on the forgotten side of Industrial Boulevard. For 6 years, she'd been the definition of a struggling single mother working 12-hour days under car hoods, barely keeping the lights on, and somehow managing to raise 2 brilliant daughters, while living paycheck to paycheck in a town that seemed to specialize in broken dreams. The auto shop she'd purchased for $800 down had been sitting empty for 3 years after old Earl Miller died of a heart attack while changing oil on a 1995 Buick. The building was a testament to better days. In Millfield, a 2-bay garage with hydraulic lifts that hadn't worked in over a decade, an office that reeked of motor oil and disappointment, and living quarters in the back that Earl had used when his wife kicked him out for spending more time with carburetors than with her. The roof leaked when it rained, the heating system barely functioned during Ohio's brutal winters, and the electrical wiring looked like it had been installed sometime during the Eisenhower administration. But Sarah Martinez saw something in that decrepit building that no one else could see, while other potential buyers had taken one look at the crumbling concrete floors, the rust-stained walls, and the ancient equipment, and walked away shaking their heads. Sarah had spent 2 hours carefully examining every inch of the property with the focused intensity of someone who understood the strategic value of overlooking a major highway intersection while maintaining the appearance of complete insignificance. The townspeople of Millfield had watched Sarah's arrival with the mixture of curiosity and skepticism that small industrial towns reserve for outsiders who appear to have even less money than the locals. Millfield, Ohio wasn't the kind of place people moved to, it was the kind of place people moved through, usually as quickly as possible. Located exactly 47 miles southeast of Columbus, the town had been built around the Millfield Steelworks. In 1952, thrived for exactly 30 years, and had been slowly dying ever since the plant closed in 1982. Main Street stretched for 6 blocks and told the story of economic decline through a series of empty storefronts, hand-painted for rent, signs, and businesses that had optimistically opened and pessimistically closed. Rodriguez Family Restaurant served food that was edible but forgettable. Thompson's Hardware stayed open mainly because Old Man Thompson had nowhere else to go and nothing else to do. The Millfield Savings and Loan had been bought by a regional bank that clearly wanted to close the branch, but hadn't figured out how to do it without looking completely heartless. The town's population had peaked at 8,400 in 1979 and had been steadily declining ever since. Young people left for college and never came back. Middle-aged workers commuted to Columbus when they could find jobs. Retirees stayed because they couldn't afford to move, and because Millfield was the kind of place where a Social Security check could still cover basic living expenses if you weren't particular about luxury or excitement. Miller's Auto Repair, and moved into the back rooms with her twin daughters, Emily and Sophia. She became an instant source of speculation and concern. Here was a young woman, she appeared to be in her early 30s, who had clearly seen better days, moving to a town that most people were trying to escape, with 2 little girls who spoke in whispers and seemed to flinch whenever adults raised their voices. Sarah's first months in Millfield were a masterclass in strategic integration and carefully managed visibility. She understood that in a small town where everyone knew everyone's business, the key to hiding in plain sight was to become exactly interesting enough to satisfy curiosity without encouraging deeper investigation. She needed to be memorable enough that people would feel they knew her story, but unremarkable enough that no one would dig deeper into her background. Her approach was methodical and brilliant. Within a week of arriving, she had introduced herself to every business owner on Main Street, explaining that she was a recently divorced single mother who had fled an abusive relationship in Texas and was looking for a fresh start somewhere. Her ex-husband would never think to look. The story was heartbreaking enough to generate sympathy, specific enough to feel authentic, and frightening enough to discourage. The kind of helpful phone calls that might lead to background checks or contact with authorities in Texas, she chose Texas deliberately, knowing that Ohio residents would find it believable that someone might flee from one struggling industrial town to another, and that the distance would make casual verification virtually impossible. She spoke with a slight Southern accent that suggested Texas roots without being so pronounced as to seem fake, and she sprinkled her conversation with references to places like Amarillo and Lubbock that she could have learned from any travel guide, but that sounded authentic to people who had never been to Texas. Sarah's first priority was establishing her competence as an auto mechanic, which required demonstrating technical knowledge that was impressive but not so sophisticated. As to raise questions about where she had acquired such skills, she claimed to have learned from her father, who had owned a garage in a small Texas town, and from her ex-husband, who had been a mechanic before he became abusive. This backstory explained her expertise while reinforcing the narrative of a woman who had been forced to become self-sufficient after escaping a dangerous situation. The first car Sarah worked on in Millfield belonged to Maria Santos, a 60-year-old cleaning lady whose 1998 Toyota Camry had been making a grinding noise that 3 other mechanics in the area had been unable to diagnose. Sarah spent 20 minutes under the hood, identified a failing water pump bearing that the other mechanics had missed, and fixed the problem for $40, about half what the Toyota dealership in Columbus would have charged. Word spread quickly through Millfield's informal communication network. Maria Santos told her sister, who told her neighbor, who mentioned it to the cashier at the grocery store, who passed it along to the next customer in line. Within a week, Sarah had a steady stream of customers who were drawn not just by her reasonable prices, but by her obvious competence and her refreshing honesty about what needed to be fixed and what could wait. Sarah's approach to customer service was carefully calculated to build trust and loyalty while maintaining appropriate boundaries. She was friendly, but not overly social, competent, but not intimidating, and honest about her limitations without appearing incompetent. She would explain repairs in simple terms, show customers the problems she had found, to provide written estimates that she'd never exceeded. She worked efficiently, but never appeared to rush, and she treated every car as if it belonged to someone who couldn't afford to have the work done wrong. Most importantly, Sarah demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to fix problems that other mechanics couldn't solve. Her diagnostic skills were extraordinary. Her knowledge of automotive systems was encyclopedic, and her ability to improvise solutions using available parts and tools bordered on miraculous. Customers began bringing her vehicles that had been declared unfixable by other shops, and Sarah would methodically work through complex electrical problems, transmission issues, and engine troubles that had stumped mechanics with decades more apparent experience. While Sarah was establishing her professional reputation, she was simultaneously creating a home environment for Emily and Sophia that would allow them to develop normal childhood experiences while maintaining the operational security required. By her real mission, this balancing act required extraordinary skill and constant vigilance, as she had to protect her daughters from knowing about her classified work while ensuring that work didn't interfere with their emotional and educational development. The living quarters behind the auto shop had been Earl Miller's bachelor retreat, a combination of workshop, man cave, and storage area that had all the charm of a poorly maintained garage. Sarah spent her first month in Millfield transforming the space into a home that could nurture two growing girls, while concealing the sophisticated technology and security measures required for her military operations. She installed new drywall to cover the oil-stained concrete block walls, put in laminate flooring to replace the cracked concrete, and created separate bedrooms for the girls using clever space division that made the small area feel larger and more private. The kitchen was updated with basic appliances purchased from the classified ads. The living area was furnished with mismatched furniture from garage sales and thrift stores that created a cozy, lived-in atmosphere. But beneath this carefully constructed domesticity, Sarah was installing some of the most sophisticated communication and security equipment available to military intelligence operations. Hidden within the walls were fiber optic cables that connected to encrypted satellite uplinks. Concealed in the ceiling were motion sensors and thermal imaging devices that could detect unauthorized approach from any direction. Television. Antenna on the roof actually contained radar equipment capable of tracking aircraft within a 50-mile radius. Emily and Sophia Martinez were remarkable children who had adapted to their unusual circumstances with the resilience that children sometimes display when they have no other choice. They had been born into military life, spending their early years on various bases, while their mother pursued a career they were too young to understand. They knew their mother was in the Army, but they thought she fixed helicopters and trucks, which wasn't entirely inaccurate given her cover identity as a motor transport maintenance specialist. The twins were fraternal rather than identical, with Emily displaying a serious, analytical personality that mirrored her mother's methodical approach to problems, while Sophia was more outgoing and creative. With an artistic temperament that provided emotional balance to their small family, both girls were exceptionally bright, reading above grade level and displaying the kind of intellectual curiosity that made them stand out among their peers while also making their mother worry about the attention their academic abilities might attract. Sarah had enrolled the girls in Millfield Elementary School within a week of their arrival, understanding that their integration into the local school system was crucial for maintaining her cover identity. She presented herself as a concerned single mother who wanted her daughters to have stability after the trauma of leaving their previous life, and she volunteered for school activities, just enough to demonstrate parental involvement without becoming so visible as to attract unwanted attention. The girls' teachers were impressed by their academic performance and their polite, well-behaved demeanor, but they also noticed signs of the emotional stress that came from their unconventional living situation. Emily and Sophia were mature beyond their years, speaking with the careful precision of children who had learned that words had consequences and that family secrets needed to be protected. They were popular with their classmates but maintained a certain emotional distance that suggested they understood, even at 8 years old, that their family was different from others. Sarah attended every parent-teacher conference, school play, and soccer game. But she always seemed slightly distracted, as if part of her attention was focused on something beyond the immediate situation. She carried herself with a posture and awareness that suggested military training, but she explained her alertness as the natural caution of a woman who had survived an abusive relationship and was always watching for potential threats. The other parents in Millfield found Sarah to be friendly but mysterious. She would chat about school activities and local events, but she skillfully deflected personal questions and never shared details about her background beyond the basic story about fleeing Texas. She was helpful when asked to contribute to school fundraisers or volunteer for activities, but she never initiated social contact and politely declined invitations to adult gatherings where alcohol might loosen tongues and lead to uncomfortable questions. Miller's Auto Repair became the perfect cover for Sarah's real mission because it provided logical explanations for several operational requirements that would have been impossible to conceal in other types of businesses. The shop's location at the intersection of two major highways provided excellent surveillance, opportunities for monitoring traffic patterns and identifying potential security threats. The building's industrial zoning allowed for modifications and equipment installations that would have been prohibited in residential areas. And most importantly, the nature of automotive repair work provided cover for the sophisticated tools, electronic equipment, and irregular hours that were essential to her military intelligence operations. The 2 hydraulic lifts in the main garage bays had been installed by Earl Miller in the 1970s and hadn't functioned properly in over a decade. Most potential buyers had seen them as expensive obstacles that would need to be removed or replaced. But Sarah immediately recognized their potential for concealing access to underground facilities. The lifts were positioned over concrete pads that appeared to be standard garage foundations but could actually be modified to provide entry points to subterranean installations. Sarah's first major modification to the shop was ostensibly practical. She hired a local contractor to repair the hydraulic lifts and reinforce the concrete foundation underneath them. The contractor, Jim Patterson, was a semi-retired handyman who was grateful for the work and asked few questions about the specific technical requirements Sarah provided. He assumed she wanted the lifts repaired so she could handle larger vehicles and heavier repair jobs, which seemed like a reasonable business decision for someone trying to expand her customer base. What Jim Patterson didn't realize was that his foundation repair work actually involved creating access points to a sophisticated underground facility that extended 30 feet below the garage floor. The hydraulic lifts were modified with additional controls that allowed them to function as cargo elevators, providing secure access to subterranean levels that contain some of the most advanced military communication and analysis equipment outside of the Pentagon itself. The shop's electrical system provided another perfect cover for operational requirements. Sarah explained to the local electrical inspector that she needed upgraded power supplies to handle modern automotive diagnostic equipment and electric vehicle charging stations, which was becoming common for auto repair shops trying to adapt to changing technology. The electrical upgrades she actually installed were capable of powering equipment that required the kind of clean, uninterrupted power typically found only in military installations and research facilities. Base grew steadily throughout her first year in Millfield, drawn by her combination of technical expertise, reasonable prices, and reliable service. She specialized in difficult diagnostic problems that other mechanics couldn't solve, which gave her a reputation for miraculous problem-solving abilities, while also providing perfect cover for the electronic testing equipment and sophistication analysis tools that were actually part of her military intelligence operations. Regular customers began to depend on Sarah not just for automotive repairs, but for her uncanny ability to anticipate problems before they became serious. She would notice where patterns that suggested impending failures, identify potential safety issues during routine maintenance, and recommend preventive measures that saved her customers hundreds of dollars in emergency repairs. Her diagnostic skills seemed almost supernatural to people who didn't understand that her training in military electronics and systems analysis gave her insights into mechanical problems that most civilian mechanics would never develop. The shop's irregular hours were explained by Sarah's need to accommodate customers who worked during normal business hours and could only bring their vehicles in during evenings or weekends. This flexibility made her popular with working families and shift workers, but it also provided cover for activities that occurred during times when the shop appeared to be closed. Neighbors became accustomed to seeing lights in the garage late at night and hearing equipment running at unusual hours, assuming that Sarah was working on particularly difficult repairs or catch up on backlogged work. Sarah's integration into Millfield's social fabric was a carefully orchestrated process that required her to become visible enough to be accepted as a community member while maintaining enough privacy to protect her operational security. She understood that in a small town, isolation would be more suspicious than controlled interaction. So she systematically built relationships that would satisfy local curiosity while reinforcing her cover identity. Her first ally in the community was Margaret Thompson, a 67-year-old widow who owned Thompson's Hardware and had been watching Millfield's slow decline for over 40 years. Margaret had initially been skeptical of Sarah, wondering what kind of woman would move to a dying town with 2 young children and think she could make a living fixing cars. But Sarah's first visit to the hardware store had impressed Margaret. With her knowledge of automotive tools and her respectful attitude toward the older woman's experience and advice, Sarah made a point of shopping at Thompson's Hardware whenever possible Even when she could have purchased tools and supplies more cheaply in Columbus, she would ask Margaret's advice about local suppliers, building maintenance issues, community customs, treating the older woman as a valuable source of information, while gradually sharing carefully selected details about her own background and challenges. This relationship served multiple purposes. It provided Sarah with intelligence about local personalities and politics. It established her as someone who respected community traditions, and it gave Margaret a sense of purpose. In helping a young mother succeed in difficult circumstances, the relationship with Margaret Thompson also provided Sarah with valuable information about Millfield's informal power structure and communication networks. Margaret had lived in the town long enough to know every family's history, every business, relationship, and every personal conflict that might affect Sarah's operations. She understood which residents could be trusted with confidential information, which ones were incorrigible gossips, and which ones had connections to law enforcement or government agencies that might pose security risks. Sarah's relationship with the Rodriguez family, who owned the town's only restaurant, developed more slowly but became equally important for her integration into the community. Carlos and Elena Rodriguez had immigrated from Mexico in the 1990s and had struggled to build their business in a town where some residents were suspicious of outsiders. They understood the challenges Sarah faced as a newcomer trying to establish herself in an insular community. They appreciated her respectful treatment of their daughter Rosa, who was in the same class as Emily and Sophia at the elementary school. The Rodriguez family became Sarah's primary source of information about the town's Hispanic community, which included several families who worked in construction, landscaping, and agricultural jobs throughout the region. This network provided Sarah with valuable intelligence about seasonal labor patterns, transportation routes, and economic activities that might be relevant to her security mission. The Rodriguez family also served as character references when other Hispanic residents were initially suspicious of a single Anglo woman who claimed to be fleeing an abusive relationship. Sarah's most strategically important relationship was with Police Chief Robert Walsh, a 28-year veteran of law enforcement who served as Millfield's only full-time police officer. Walsh was a competent, honest cop who took his responsibilities seriously despite being understaffed and underfunded. He had initially been concerned about Sarah's arrival, running background checks that revealed nothing suspicious about Sarah Martinez from Texas, but also nothing that could be independently verified. Chief Walsh's suspicions were gradually allayed by Sarah's consistent behavior, her positive contributions to the community, and her respectful cooperation whenever their professional duties intersected. She always had current vehicle registrations and insurance documentation. She maintained her business licenses properly, and she reported safety concerns or suspicious activities that came to her attention through her work. Most importantly, she demonstrated the kind of situational awareness and respect for law enforcement that suggested someone who understood the importance of maintaining good relationships with local authorities. What Chief Walsh didn't realize was that Sarah's background checks had been carefully managed by military intelligence professionals, who ensured that any official inquiry would find exactly the information they wanted local authorities to see. Her identity as Sarah Martinez was supported by genuine documentation, but the documentation told a story that had been crafted to withstand casual investigation while concealing her true military identity and mission. The most challenging aspect of Sarah's assignment was maintaining the psychological and emotional balance required to be both an effective intelligence operative and a nurturing mother to two young girls who needed stability, affection, and normal childhood experiences. This dual role required her to compartmentalize her life in ways that most people could never imagine, switching seamlessly between her identity as Colonel Vasquez, responsible for national security operations that could affect millions of lives, and her identity as Sarah Martinez, responsible for helping with homework, packing school lunches, and attending soccer games. Emily and Sophia had adapted to their unusual lifestyle with remarkable resilience. But they were still children who needed consistent parental attention and emotional support. They had experienced enough upheaval in their young lives to understand that their family was different from others, but they were too young to understand the full scope of their mother's responsibilities or the potential consequences of operational security failures. Sarah's daily routine was a masterpiece of time management, and priority balancing. She would wake at 5:30 a.m. to review overnight intelligence reports and communicate with her handlers before the girls woke up for school. She would prepare breakfast, help with homework, and drive the girls to school while monitoring radio frequencies and analyzing traffic patterns for potential security threats. She would spend the morning working on actual automotive repairs, using the customer interactions as opportunities to observe local activities and gather community intelligence. Afternoons were dedicated to more intensive intelligence work, analyzing data from various sources and preparing reports for transmission to her superiors. She would coordinate with other operatives, monitor international communication channels, and track potential threats that might require immediate attention. But she always stopped work in time to pick up the girls from school, help with homework, prepare dinner like any other single mother, trying to balance work and family responsibilities. Evenings were family time, with board games, television, shows, and bedtime stories that provided the girls with the stability and affection they needed while giving Sarah the emotional connection that made all her sacrifices worthwhile. She read to them every night, helped with school projects, and listened to their concerns about friends, teachers, and the normal childhood worries that seemed both trivial and enormously important. Compared to the international security issues she dealt with during working hours, the girls were aware that their mother worked unusual hours and had responsibilities they didn't fully understand. But they accepted this as normal because it was the only life they had ever known. They understood that certain parts of the garage were off limits and that they should never answer questions about their mother's work or their family's background. They had learned these lessons not through fear, but through Sarah's patient explanations about privacy, safety, and the importance of being careful about what information they shared with others. Sarah's greatest fear was that her dual responsibilities would eventually conflict in ways that would force her to choose between her mission and her daughter's welfare. She had contingency plans for emergency situations that might require her to relocate the girls or temporarily separate from them for their safety, but she hoped those plans would never be necessary. Her assignment in Millfield was supposed to be a stable, long-term posting that would allow her to fulfill her military duties while providing her daughters with the consistent home environment they needed. The emotional toll of maintaining this double life was enormous. But Sarah found strength in knowing that her work was protecting not just national security, but the kind of world where her daughters could grow up safely, pursue their education, and build lives of their own choosing. Every successful operation, every threat neutralized, every piece of critical intelligence she provided contributed to a safer world for Emily and Sophia, and for millions of other children whose parents would never know that their safety depended partly on the sacrifices made by people like Colonel Sarah Elena Vasquez. As Sarah tucked her daughters into bed each night, reading them stories about brave princesses and clever heroes, she understood that she was living her own fairy tale, one where the real magic was the love that motivated extraordinary sacrifice, and where the happy ending would be measured not in personal recognition or reward, but in the peaceful lives of two little girls who would grow up never knowing that their mother had spent every day protecting them from a dangerous world they couldn't even imagine. The contents of that safety deposit box, discovered after Sarah's tragic death, reveal the full scope of her incredible double life and transform not just how Millfield understood their beloved mechanic, but how America understood the true meaning of heroism, sacrifice, and the lengths to which some people will go to protect the innocence of childhood and the promise of tomorrow. To understand the earthquake that Sarah Martinez's death would cause in Millfield, you need to understand what kind of community this was in 2024. And more importantly, who the townspeople believed Sarah to be during her 6 years among them. Millfield, Ohio, wasn't just any declining industrial town. It was a place where people knew each other's stories, where gossip traveled faster than broadband internet, where a single mother fixing cars while raising twin daughters had become a symbol of resilience that the entire community had rallied around. The town sat in a valley between rolling hills that had once been dotted with family farms, but were now mostly empty fields growing back to wilderness. Interstate 70 ran 4 miles to the north, close enough that you could hear the truck traffic. On quiet nights, but far enough away that most travelers never took the exit for Millfield, unless they were lost or desperate for gas. State Route 33 cut directly through the town center, carrying a steady stream of commuters between the smaller communities scattered throughout southeastern Ohio. But most of that traffic moved through Millfield without stopping, seeing only the faded storefronts and for-lease signs that told the story of economic decline. Main Street was 6 blocks of brick buildings constructed during the town's brief prosperity in the 1960s and 1970s, when the Millfield Steel Works employed over 2,000 people and supported a network of suppliers, contractors, and service businesses that made the town feel like it had a sustainable future. Now, half the storefronts were empty, their windows covered with newspaper or plywood, decorated with hand-painted signs advertising rental space that nobody seemed interested in leasing. But Millfield wasn't quite dead. It was more like a town, in hibernation, waiting for something to revive it or finally put it out of its misery. Rodriguez Family Restaurant served breakfast and lunch to a loyal clientele of retirees, shift workers, and the occasional lost traveler. Thompson's Hardware survived because Margaret Thompson was too stubborn to close, and because there were enough local residents who needed basic supplies to keep the business marginally profitable. First National Bank of Millfield had been absorbed by a regional chain, but still maintained a branch office with 2 tellers and a loan officer who commuted from Columbus 3 days a week. The town's institutional infrastructure reflected its shrinking population and declining resources. The volunteer fire department operated out of a building that doubled as the town hall. Staffed by 12 volunteers whose average age was pushing 60, the police department consisted of Chief Robert Walsh, a part-time officer who worked weekends, and a dispatcher who also answered phones for the water department. Millfield Elementary School served grades K-8 with 6 teachers and 127 students, while high school students were bused to the consolidated school in neighboring Fairfield, 23 miles away. This was the world that Sarah Martinez had entered in 2018, and it was a world that had embraced her story of survival and determination with the kind of fierce loyalty that small communities reserve for people who choose to stay and fight rather than give up and leave. In a town where most newcomers were either running from something or looking for the cheapest possible place to live, Sarah had presented herself as someone who was doing both, running from an abusive marriage while trying to build a better life for her daughters on the smallest possible budget. Sarah's first year in Millfield had been a carefully orchestrated performance of economic struggle and maternal determination that had won her the respect and affection of virtually everyone in town. She had arrived with almost no money, to frighten children in a story that explained her desperation while discouraging too many questions about her background. The townspeople had watched her transform Miller's abandoned garage from a symbol of the town's decline into a thriving business that served the community while providing a stable home for 2 remarkable little girls. The transformation of Miller's auto repair had been visible to the entire community, and everyone felt invested in Sarah's success. During her first months in town, neighbors would drive past the garage just to see what progress she was making. They watched her install new lighting, repair the roof, and gradually turn the rundown building into a clean, professional-looking business. The hydraulic lifts that hadn't worked in years were mysteriously repaired. The office was painted and furnished with mismatched furniture that Sarah had rescued from garage sales, and the living quarters in the back were converted into a cozy home where 2 little girls could feel safe and loved. Margaret Thompson had become Sarah's unofficial mentor and champion, partly because she admired the younger woman's determination, and partly because she remembered her own struggles as a young wife trying to help her husband build Thompson's hardware from nothing. Margaret would tell anyone who would listen that Sarah Martinez was exactly the kind of person Millfield needed, someone who wasn't afraid of hard work, who treated people fairly, and who was committed to building something lasting rather than just making a quick profit. "That girl works harder than any 2 men I know," Margaret would say to customers browsing the hardware store's narrow aisles. "She's out there at 6 in the morning getting ready for the day. And I've seen lights on in that garage past midnight when she's working on some complicated repair job." And those daughters of hers, well-behaved, smart as whips, polite to everyone they meet. Sarah's raising them right, despite everything she's been through. The everything she's been through was a reference to the carefully constructed backstory that Sarah had shared with Margaret and a few other trusted community members during her first months in Millfield. According to Sarah's account, she had married her high school sweetheart in a small Texas town, believing she was building a life with a man who would provide security and partnership. Instead, she had found herself trapped in an increasingly abusive relationship with a husband whose drinking problem had gradually destroyed his ability to hold a job, and whose frustration had turned into violence directed at both Sarah and the twins. Sarah's story about her escape from Texas was heartbreaking enough to generate sympathy, while being vague enough to discourage detailed questions. She spoke of saving money in secret, planning her departure for months, finally fleeing in the middle of the night with her daughters and whatever possessions they could fit in her aging Honda Civic. She had chosen Ohio because it was far enough from Texas to provide safety, cheap enough that her limited resources could stretch far enough to provide for her family, and unfamiliar enough that her ex-husband would never think to look for her there. The details of Sarah's abuse story were carefully calibrated to explain her wariness around men, her hypervigilance about security, and her reluctance to share personal information while generating enough sympathy to discourage invasive questions. About her background, she would occasionally display what appeared to be reflexive flinching when people made sudden movements. She was obviously uncomfortable when men raised their voices even in normal conversation, and she had a way of positioning herself near exits that suggested someone who had learned to always have an escape route planned. These behavioral patterns served multiple purposes in maintaining Sarah's cover identity. They explained her obvious military training and situational awareness as the survival skills of an abuse survivor. They justified her sophisticated security measures as the reasonable precautions of a woman who was afraid her abuser might track her down. Most importantly, they generated protective instincts in the community that made people less likely to ask probing questions about her background, and more likely to respect her privacy and support her efforts to build a new life. Emily and Sophia Martinez had become beloved figures in Millfield Elementary School and throughout the community, admired for their academic achievements, their polite behavior, and their obvious devotion to their mother. The twins were fraternal rather than identical, with Emily displaying a serious, analytical personality that made her popular with teachers, while Sophia's artistic temperament and outgoing nature made her the social center of their fourth-grade class. Both girls were reading at high school levels and consistently scored at the top of their class in mathematics, science, and language arts. Their teachers marveled at their intellectual curiosity and their ability to tackle complex problems with patience and systematic thinking that seemed far beyond their years. Emily showed particular aptitude for mathematics and logic puzzles, often finishing assignments in half the time allotted while helping classmates who were struggling with concepts she seemed to grasp intuitively. The community's support extended to protective measures that reflected their understanding of Sarah's vulnerability as a single mother who was potentially being stalked by an abusive ex-husband. Chief Walsh made a point of driving past the auto shop several times each day, not because he suspected any problems, but because he wanted potential troublemakers to know that Sarah and her daughters were under police protection. The volunteer fire department had installed additional smoke detectors and fire extinguishers in the building without being asked. Several residents had quietly provided Sarah with their phone numbers and instructions to call if she ever felt threatened or needed emergency assistance. This protective network had been tested during Sarah's third year in Millfield, when a man claiming to be her ex-husband had appeared at the auto shop asking questions about her whereabouts and demanding to see his children. The incident had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had mobilized the entire community's protective instincts and demonstrated the lengths to which Millfield residents would go to defend someone they considered family. The man had been middle-aged, aggressive, and obviously drunk when he arrived at the shop on a Tuesday afternoon while Sarah was working alone. He had demanded to know where Maria Elena Vasquez was hiding and had claimed that she had kidnapped his children and stolen money from their joint bank account. When Sarah had calmly explained that there was no one by that name at the shop and that he needed to leave immediately, the man had become increasingly belligerent and had begun making threats about what would happen when he found his wife and kids. Within minutes of the confrontation beginning, half a dozen community members had arrived at the shop, summoned by customers who had witnessed the incident and recognized it as the kind of situation that Sarah had been afraid might happen. Chief Walsh had arrived with the man's license plate number already radioed to state police. Margaret Thompson had positioned herself between the stranger and the building's entrance, and Carlos Rodriguez had brought two of his adult sons who made it clear that the visitor needed to leave immediately. The incident had ended when the man realized he was outnumbered and legally vulnerable, but not before Chief Walsh had documented his threats, photographed his vehicle, and made it clear that any return to Millfield would result in immediate arrest for trespassing and harassment. State police had run background checks that revealed the man was wanted on domestic violence charges in 3 different states, and he was arrested at a truck stop in West Virginia 2 days later. What the community never learned was that the incident had been a test orchestrated by Sarah's military handlers to evaluate her cover identity and the community's response to potential security threats. The abusive ex-husband had actually been a military intelligence operative who was assessing whether Sarah's backstory was believable enough to generate the kind of protective response that would help maintain her operational security. The test had been successful beyond expectations, demonstrating that Millfield residents would actively defend Sarah and her daughters against threats, while never questioning the details of her story or demanding proof of her claims. While the community celebrated Sarah's success as a business owner and single mother, there were subtle aspects of her operation that might have raised questions if anyone had been paying attention with a more analytical mindset. Sarah's efficiency as a mechanic was remarkable even by professional standards, and her diagnostic abilities seemed to exceed what would be expected from someone with her claimed background and experience. Her tool collection was far more extensive and sophisticated than what most small-town mechanics could afford, including electronic testing equipment that cost more than many people's annual income. She had access to technical manuals and computer databases that provided detailed information about vehicles and repair procedures that weren't readily available to independent shops. Most puzzling, she seemed to have knowledge of automotive systems and technologies that hadn't been widely taught when she claimed to have learned her trade. Sarah's parts procurement was another area where her efficiency seemed almost too good to be true. She could locate rare components for vintage vehicles, obtain specialty tools for specific repair procedures, and arrange for overnight delivery of parts that other shops said would take weeks to acquire. Her suppliers appeared to be national distributors who typically only worked with large dealerships or fleet operators, not small independent garages in rural Ohio. The shop's financial performance was also remarkably stable for a business that was supposedly operating on minimal capital and supporting a single mother with 2 children. Never seemed to struggle with cash flow problems. She maintained current accounts with multiple suppliers, and she had been able to invest in equipment upgrades and building improvements that suggested access to capital beyond what her visible income would support. Her working hours were another puzzle that the community had accepted without question. Sarah was often seen working late into the evening on repair jobs that seemed more complex than typical automotive maintenance, and customers who arrived unexpectedly would sometimes find her engaged in projects that didn't appear to be related to vehicle repair. She would quickly shift to customer service mode, but not before briefly securing equipment or closing off areas of the shop that she explained were related to special projects or experimental work. The building's security measures were more sophisticated than what would typically be found at a small-town auto repair shop. Sarah had installed high-quality locks, motion-activated lighting, and a security system that seemed designed to protect against threats more serious than typical burglary or vandalism. She was obviously concerned about unauthorized access to certain areas of the building, and she had developed procedures for securing sensitive equipment that suggested she was protecting more than just automotive tools and parts. Despite these subtle anomalies, Sarah's integration into Millfield had been so complete, and her persona as a struggling single mother so convincing that no one in the community suspected she was anything other than exactly what she appeared to be. Her story made sense. Her behavior was consistent with her claimed background, and her success was clearly the result of hard work, intelligence, and determination rather than any mysterious advantages or hidden resources. The key to Sarah's successful deception was her understanding that effective cover identities require more than just false documentation. They required genuine emotional investment in the role being played. Sarah truly cared about her customers. She was genuinely devoted to her daughter's welfare and education, and she had developed real friendships with community members who had provided support and acceptance during her most vulnerable moments. Her military training had taught her that the most effective lies were built on foundations of truth, and her life in Millfield contained enough genuine elements to make her false identity feel authentic to herself as well as to others. She really was a single mother facing the challenges of raising 2 children while building a business in a difficult economic environment. She really was trying to create a stable, safe home for Emily and Sophia while protecting them from dangers they couldn't understand. She really was committed to serving her community and contributing to its economic and social stability. The difference was that Sarah's challenges were far more complex than anyone realized. Her dangers were global rather than personal, and her service extended far beyond automotive repair to include responsibilities that affected national security and international stability. But these additional layers of complexity were invisible to the community because they were built on a foundation of genuine care, authentic relationships, and real commitment to the life she had created in Millfield. As Sarah tucked Emily and Sophia into bed each night in their modest home behind the auto shop, reading them stories and listening to their accounts of school activities and friendship dramas, she was simultaneously maintaining communication with military intelligence networks that spanned the globe and monitoring security threats that could affect millions of lives. But her daughters saw only a devoted mother who was always available when they needed her, and the community saw only a hardworking woman who had overcome adversity to build a successful business while raising 2 remarkable children. The contents of that safety deposit box would reveal the extraordinary truth about Sarah Martinez's real identity and mission. But it would also confirm that everything the community loved and admired about her had been absolutely genuine. Woman they knew as their beloved mechanic and neighbor really was the devoted mother, skilled, professional, and caring community member they had embraced. She just happened to also be Colonel Sarah Elena Vasquez, one of the most effective military intelligence operatives in American history. Looking back, the people of Millfield would realize that the signs had been there all along: subtle inconsistencies in Sarah Martinez's story, unexplained capabilities that seemed impossible for a small-town mechanic, and mysterious behaviors that everyone had accepted as quirks of personality rather than evidence of a double life that would have been unimaginable to the residents of their quiet Ohio town. Margaret Thompson would later tell investigators that she had always sensed something different about Sarah, though she had never been able to articulate exactly what it was. There was something in the way she carried herself, Margaret would recall, like she was always aware of everything happening around her, even when she seemed to be focused on something else. And her hands, they were too soft for someone who supposedly grew up working on cars with her father. But these observations had been dismissed as the overcautious instincts of an elderly woman who had lived through enough changes in Millfield to be suspicious of anyone new. The community had wanted Sarah's story to be true, had needed her success to represent hope for their struggling town, and had collectively chosen to overlook the details that didn't quite fit the narrative they had embraced. Sarah's diagnostic abilities had become legendary throughout southeastern Ohio, drawing customers from as far as Cincinnati and Cleveland, who had heard about the single mother in Millfield, who could solve automotive problems that stumped dealership mechanics with decades of experience. But her methods were unlike anything other mechanics had ever encountered, relying on equipment and techniques that seemed to belong in a high-tech laboratory rather than a small-town garage. Her electronic testing equipment was the first anomaly. That should have raised questions. The shop contained oscilloscopes, spectrum analyzers, and computer diagnostic systems that cost more than most independent shops grossed in an entire year. When curious customers or visiting mechanics asked about the sophisticated equipment, Sarah would explain that she had purchased it used from a military surplus dealer who was upgrading government vehicle maintenance facilities. The explanation? was plausible enough to satisfy casual curiosity, while being vague enough to discourage detailed follow-up questions. The reality was that Sarah's diagnostic equipment was state-of-the-art, military hardware that had been disguised to look like civilian automotive tools. Her oscilloscopes were actually signal analysis devices capable of detecting and decoding encrypted communications. Her computer diagnostic systems were connected to military databases that provided real-time intelligence on vehicle movements throughout the region. Her spectrum analyzers could monitor radio frequencies across multiple bands while appearing to test automotive electrical systems. Tom Patterson, a retired automotive instructor from the Regional Technical College, had visited the shop during Sarah's second year in Millfield to observe her techniques and possibly recommend her services to his former students. He had been amazed by her ability to diagnose complex electrical problems using methods that he had never encountered in 30 years of teaching automotive technology. She could identify intermittent faults that other mechanics would spend days trying to locate. Patterson would later tell federal investigators. She had these testing procedures that seemed to bypass all the normal diagnostic steps, going straight to the source of problems using equipment that I'd never seen before. When I asked her where she had learned those techniques, she said she had figured them out through trial and error. But those weren't trial and error methods. They were systematic approaches that suggested formal training in electronics and systems analysis. Sarah's parts procurement was another mystery that the automotive community had accepted without adequate scrutiny. She could locate components for vehicles that were so rare that other mechanics claimed the parts no longer existed. She had access to suppliers who could provide overnight delivery of specialized components that typically required weeks of special ordering. Most puzzling, she sometimes received shipments that were delivered by unmarked vehicles rather than standard commercial carriers, and these deliveries always arrived during evening hours when the shop was officially closed. The unmarked deliveries were actually supply runs from military logistics networks that were supporting Sarah's intelligence operations. The automotive parts in these shipments included communication equipment, surveillance devices, and specialized tools that were essential for her real mission. The timing of these deliveries was coordinated to avoid observation by customers or neighbors, and Sarah had developed procedures for quickly transferring the sensitive equipment to secure storage areas before any civilian vehicles approached the shop. Jerry Mitchell, who operated the parts counter at Fairfield Auto Supply, had become increasingly puzzled by Sarah's ordering patterns and her apparent access to distribution networks that were unavailable to other independent shops. She would call and ask for parts that I knew were discontinued, and then a week later, she would have exactly what she needed, Mitchell recalled. When I asked her where she was getting these components, she would just smile and say she had connections from her time in Texas, but those weren't Texas connections, those were military supply networks. Sarah's concern about security had been attributed to her backstory as an abuse survivor, who was afraid her ex-husband might track her down, but her actual security measures far exceeded what would be reasonable for personal protection. The auto shop was equipped with surveillance systems that could monitor approaches from multiple directions, motion sensors that detected movement within a half-mile radius, and communication systems that could instantly alert law enforcement or emergency services to potential threats. The building's physical security was equally sophisticated, with reinforced locks, steel window guards, and access control systems that required electronic authorization for entry to certain areas. Sarah had explained these measures as necessary precautions for a single mother living in an isolated location with valuable equipment and tools that might attract burglars, but security experts would later recognize the installation as a professional grade defensive system designed to protect against threats far more serious than typical criminal activity. Chief Walsh had noticed the sophisticated security measures during his routine patrols, but he had interpreted them as evidence of Sarah's traumatic past rather than indications of ongoing security concerns. She had obviously been through something terrible, Walsh would later explain to federal investigators. The security system seemed excessive for a small-town auto shop, but it made sense if you understood that she was trying to protect herself and her daughters from someone who had already hurt them once. The security system's true capabilities included encrypted communication links to military command centers, automated threat assessment protocols that could distinguish between routine visitors and potential security risks, and emergency procedures that could initiate evacuation or defensive responses within seconds of detecting unauthorized intrusion. The system was designed to protect not just Sarah and her daughters, but also the classified intelligence operations that were being conducted beneath the garage floor. Sarah's personal security habits were another area where her military training was evident to anyone who knew what to look for. She maintained constant situational awareness, positioning herself to observe all entrances and exits whenever she was in public spaces. She varied her routines to avoid predictable patterns that could be exploited by hostile surveillance. Most telling, she demonstrated defensive skills and physical capabilities that were inconsistent with her claimed background as an abuse survivor from a small Texas town. During her 4th year in Millfield, Sarah had been confronted by an intoxicated customer who became aggressive when she refused to accept payment with a check from a bank that had already been closed for insufficient funds. The man had grabbed her wrist and attempted to intimidate her into accepting the worthless check. But Sarah's response had been swift and decisive. Within seconds, the customer found himself face down on the garage floor with his arm twisted behind his back in a restraint hold that suggested professional training in defensive tactics. The incident had lasted less than 30 seconds, ending when the customer agreed to leave peacefully and return with cash payment for his repair bill. But witnesses had been amazed by Sarah's calm efficiency in neutralizing a threat from someone who was larger and appeared more physically intimidating. When asked where she had learned such effective self-defense techniques, Sarah had claimed that her ex-husband's violence had motivated her to take a martial arts class in Texas. The explanation had satisfied local curiosity while concealing the reality that her defensive skills were the result of military combat training. Sarah's schedule included regular absences that she explained as medical appointments, family obligations, or business meetings in Columbus. But the frequency and timing of these trips suggested activities that went beyond routine personal affairs. She would typically close the shop for 2 or 3 days each month, posting signs that announced she was attending automotive training seminars or visiting suppliers to negotiate better parts pricing. These explanations seemed reasonable for a business owner who was trying to improve her skills and reduce operating costs. But careful observers might have noticed that Sarah's absences often coincided with periods of increased military activity at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which was located 90 miles southwest of Millfield. Local police scanners would occasionally pick up increased radio traffic from federal agencies during the same periods when Sarah was supposedly attending civilian business meetings. Most puzzling, her vehicle would sometimes be observed traveling in directions that were inconsistent with her claimed destinations. The reality was that Sarah's monthly absences were actually operational briefings and coordination. Meetings with her military handlers? She would receive updated intelligence assignments, report on her observations of regional activities, coordinate with other operatives who were working related missions throughout the Midwest. These meetings were essential for maintaining her effectiveness as an intelligence asset while ensuring that her operations remained coordinated with broader national security objectives. During one particularly significant absence in her 5th year in Millfield, Sarah had claimed to be attending an advanced automotive electronics seminar in Detroit. But Michigan State Police had no record of her vehicle passing through any of the monitoring stations on the routes between Ohio and Detroit. Instead, her car had been photographed by traffic cameras traveling toward Washington, D.C., where she was actually receiving a classified briefing on emerging terrorist threats that might affect her area of operations. Emily and Sophia's care during these absences was arranged through what appeared to be informal community support networks, with Margaret Thompson, the Rodriguez family, and other trusted neighbors providing supervision and transportation for the girls. But these arrangements were actually coordinated by Sarah's military handlers, who ensured that reliable, security-cleared civilians were available to maintain the girls' normal routines, while protecting the operational security of their mothers' missions. Sarah's conversations with customers and community members occasionally revealed knowledge that seemed inconsistent with her claimed background as a self-taught mechanic from a small Texas town. She would demonstrate understanding of advanced engineering concepts, reference technical specifications that weren't commonly known outside of professional circles, and display familiarity with military vehicles and equipment that suggested experience beyond civilian automotive work. During a community meeting about potential economic development projects, Sarah had made detailed comments about the infrastructure requirements for supporting different types of industrial operations. Her analysis had included considerations of electrical capacity, communication networks, and transportation logistics that impressed the municipal engineers who were consulting on the project. When asked about her expertise in industrial planning, Sarah had explained that she had helped her father evaluate potential locations for expanding his automotive business in Texas. But Sarah's knowledge extended far beyond what would be expected. From someone who had assisted with small-scale business planning, she understood the requirements for high-security facilities, the challenges of maintaining operational security in industrial environments, and the vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile intelligence services. Her contributions to community planning discussions reflected military training in facility security and operational planning rather than civilian business experience. Her mechanical knowledge also extended into areas that were unusual for civilian mechanics. She was familiar with specialized vehicles used by military and law enforcement agencies. She understood the modifications required for armored vehicles and secure communication systems. She could diagnose problems with equipment that was typically maintained only by authorized government contractors. When customers brought military surplus vehicles for repair, Sarah could work on systems that other mechanics wouldn't even attempt to troubleshoot. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, a retired Army logistics officer who had moved to Millfield, after completing his military service, had brought his personal vehicle to Sarah's shop for routine maintenance and had been surprised by her familiarity with military automotive systems. She knew details about Army maintenance procedures that aren't taught in civilian schools. Harrison would later tell federal investigators, "When I mentioned that I had served in military logistics, she asked specific questions about supply chain security and vehicle tracking systems that suggested she understood those operations better than most civilian contractors." Sarah's financial situation was another area where careful observation might have revealed inconsistencies that contradicted her story of economic struggle. While she maintained the appearance of operating on tight margins and living paycheck to paycheck, her actual spending patterns suggested access to resources that weren't reflected in her visible income from automotive repair services. The shop's equipment purchases were the most obvious anomaly. Sarah had invested in diagnostic tools, repair equipment, and facility improvements that would typically require significant capital investment or financing arrangements. But she always paid cash for major purchases, never applied for business loans, and seemed to have access to funding sources that weren't connected to traditional banking or lending institutions. Robert Chen, the loan officer at First National Bank of Millfield, had been puzzled by Sarah's minimal use of banking services despite operating what appeared to be a successful business. She maintained a basic checking account and occasionally used our safe deposit box services, but she never applied for business credit or equipment financing, Chen recalled. For someone who was supposedly starting a business with limited capital, she seemed remarkably self-sufficient financially. Sarah's personal expenses were equally mysterious. While she maintained a modest lifestyle and drove an aging vehicle, she was able to provide her daughters with educational opportunities and resources that exceeded what would be expected for a single mother in her claimed financial situation. Emily and Sophia had access to advanced tutoring, participated in enrichment programs that required travel to other cities, and received educational materials and technology that were expensive and sophisticated. The girls' medical and dental care was another area where Sarah's resources seemed inconsistent with her apparent income. She was able to provide comprehensive health care that included specialized treatments and preventive care that many families in Millfield couldn't afford. When community members offered to help with medical expenses or suggested applying for assistance programs, Sarah politely declined, explaining that she had adequate insurance coverage through a plan she had maintained from her previous employment. In Texas, Sarah's communication habits included behaviors that suggested connections and responsibilities beyond those of a typical small-town business owner. She received phone calls at unusual hours, often stepping outside or into private areas of the shop to conduct conversations that required privacy. She had multiple cell phones, claiming that one was for business use and another was for personal communication, but the frequency and timing of calls on both devices suggested more complex communication requirements. Local cell tower records, which would later be analyzed by federal investigators, showed that Sarah's phones were accessing networks and services that weren't available to typical civilian customers. Her data usage patterns indicated encrypted communications, secure file transfers, and access to databases that required specialized authorization. The technical signatures of her communication activities were consistent with military intelligence operations rather than civilian business communications. She also demonstrated familiarity with radio equipment and communication protocols that extended beyond what would be expected. For someone with civilian automotive experience, the volunteer fire department had experienced problems with their radio system. Sarah had offered to help with troubleshooting and had quickly identified interference sources and equipment malfunctions that the department's technical coordinator hadn't been able to locate. She understood radio frequency management and signal processing in ways that suggested formal training, Fire Chief Dennis Murphy would later tell investigators. When I asked her where she had learned about radio systems, she said she had helped maintain communication equipment at the trucking company, where she worked in Texas. But her knowledge was more sophisticated than what you'd get from commercial radio maintenance. Sarah's physical capabilities and reflexes occasionally revealed evidence of training that was inconsistent with her civilian background. Her coordination, strength, endurance exceeded what would be expected for someone whose primary physical activity was automotive repair work. She could lift heavy components without assistance, work in uncomfortable positions for extended periods, and maintain focus and precision during demanding tasks that would exhaust other mechanics. Her driving skills were another area where military training was occasionally evident. During emergency situations, such as rushing to the school when one of her daughters was injured, Sarah demonstrated vehicle handling capabilities that suggested advanced driver training. She could navigate through traffic with precision and confidence that went beyond normal civilian driving experience. And she displayed defensive driving awareness that was characteristic of security and law enforcement professionals. Local police officers had noticed Sarah's exceptional driving abilities during routine traffic stops, but they had attributed these skills to her heightened caution as someone who was concerned about safety and security. Officer Mike Stevens had stopped Sarah for a minor traffic violation during her third year in Millfield and had been impressed by her calm professionalism and her knowledge of traffic laws and police procedures. She handled the traffic stop like someone who had been through police academy training, Stevens would later recall. She knew exactly what to do, where to place her hands, how to communicate with the officer, and I asked her about it. She said she had been pulled over frequently during her drive from Texas and had learned how to avoid escalating situations with police officers. But her behavior was more consistent with law enforcement training than civilian experience. The twins' exceptional academic performance and sophisticated knowledge base provided additional clues about their family's unusual circumstances, though these signs were generally attributed to Sarah's dedication as a mother rather than evidence of access to educational resources that weren't available to other Millfield families. Emily and Sophia demonstrated knowledge of geography, history, and current events that exceeded what would be expected from the curriculum at Millfield Elementary School. They could discuss international politics with unusual sophistication. They understood military and diplomatic terminology that wasn't typically taught in elementary education. And they displayed awareness of global security issues that suggested access to information sources beyond standard educational materials. Their language skills were particularly remarkable, with both girls demonstrating fluency in Spanish that exceeded what could be explained by their claimed Texas background, but their Spanish included military and technical terminology that suggested exposure to specialized vocabulary through family conversations or educational materials that weren't available in civilian contexts. Mrs. Coleman has been particularly puzzled by the girls' advanced understanding of mathematics and science concepts that weren't introduced until high school or college levels. They would sometimes reference principles or formulas that I had never heard of, she would later tell investigators. When I asked them where they had learned these concepts, they would say their mother had explained them or that they had read about them in books. But these weren't concepts that would be found in children's books or that a civilian mechanic would typically know. Despite these numerous anomalies and inconsistencies, the community of Millfield had collectively chosen to accept Sarah's story without detailed scrutiny because they needed her success to represent hope for their struggling town. She had become a symbol of resilience and determination that validated their belief that hard work and honest effort could still create success in their changing world. The residents who had noticed unusual aspects of Sarah's operation had convinced themselves that their observations were explainable through her traumatic background, her exceptional intelligence, or her dedication to providing for her daughters. They had wanted to believe in her story because it represented the odious possibility that their community could attract and support successful entrepreneurs who would contribute to local economic recovery. Margaret Thompson would later admit that she had deliberately avoided asking questions that might have revealed uncomfortable truths about Sarah's background. "I suppose I knew that something didn't quite add up," Margaret would tell federal investigators. But Sarah was good for this town. She was good for those little girls. And she was helping people solve problems that nobody else could fix. Didn't want to know anything that might change that. This collective willingness to overlook inconsistencies had been essential for maintaining Sarah's operational security. But it had also created an environment where increasingly obvious signs of her military identity could be dismissed or rationalized away. The community had become invested in protecting Sarah's secrets, even without knowing what those secrets were, creating a protective shield that allowed her to operate without fear of exposure by local residents. Police Chief Walsh had been the most likely community member to detect evidence of Sarah's true identity, given his law enforcement training and his responsibility for investigating unusual activities within his jurisdiction. But Walsh had been influenced by the same protective instincts that had affected other residents, and he had chosen to interpret anomalies as evidence of Sarah's traumatic past rather than indications of ongoing covert activities. "I knew she was hiding something," Walsh would later admit to federal investigators, "but I assumed it was related to her abusive relationship, and I didn't want to do anything that might put her or her daughters at risk." Looking back, I should have been more curious about some of the things I observed, but I trusted her and I wanted to respect her privacy. The signs had been there all along: the sophisticated equipment, the unexplained knowledge, the security measures that exceeded normal precautions, the financial resources that didn't match her apparent income, and the physical capabilities that suggested military training. But the community of Millfield had chosen love over suspicion, trust over investigation, and hope over cynicism. Their willful blindness had protected Sarah's cover for 6 years, allowing her to conduct some of the most important intelligence work in American history while raising 2 remarkable daughters in the safety and security of a small Ohio town that had embraced her as family without ever knowing who she really was. The contents of that safety deposit box would reveal that every instinct the community had chosen to ignore had been correct, but it would also confirm that their trust in Sarah's character and dedication had been absolutely justified. The woman they had protected and supported really was extraordinary, just not in the ways they had imagined. September 22nd, 2024, started like any other Sunday in Millfield. Sarah Martinez had worked late the night before, finishing a complex transmission repair for a local farmer who needed his truck ready for Monday morning. She had tucked Emily and Sophia into bed just after 10 p.m., reading them another chapter from their current favorite book about a young girl who discovers she has magical powers she never knew existed. A story that would later seem prophetically ironic to anyone who knew the truth about their mother. At 6:30 a.m., Sarah was already in the garage, performing routine maintenance on her own Honda Civic before driving the girls to their Sunday soccer games in Fairfield. Emily played defensive midfielder for the Lightning Bolts, while Sophia was the star forward for the Shooting Stars. Both teams had games that afternoon. Sarah had promised to bring orange slices and water bottles for both squads, a commitment she took as seriously as any military mission. The drive to Fairfields typically took 23 minutes along State Route 33, two-lane highway that wound through rolling hills and past abandoned farmhouses that told the story of rural Ohio's economic decline. Sarah had driven this route hundreds of times over the past 6 years, always maintaining the careful balance between normal parental anxiety and the hypervigilance that came from military training in threat assessment and defensive driving. But on this particular Sunday morning, a series of seemingly random events were converging to create the moment that would change everything for Millfield, Ohio, and reveal one of the most extraordinary stories in American military history. At exactly 11:47 a.m., Sarah was returning from Emily's game to pick up Sophia for the second match of the day. Her aging Honda Civic approached the intersection of Route 33 and Miller Road, the same intersection she had navigated safely over 2,000 times during her 6 years in Millfield. The intersection was controlled by a four-way stop that had been the site of minor fender benders over the years, but never a serious accident. Sarah had stopped completely at the intersection, as was her invariable habit, and was proceeding through the crossing when a fully loaded semi-truck, traveling eastbound on Route 33, failed to stop at the four-way intersection. The truck driver, later identified as Michael Torres from Bakersfield, California, had been driving for 14 consecutive hours in violation of federal transportation regulations, fighting fatigue with caffeine and determination to complete a delivery schedule that was impossible to maintain legally. Security camera footage from Rodriguez Family Restaurant, located 200 yards from the intersection, would later show that Sarah had attempted evasive maneuvers that demonstrated her advanced driver training. In the 2.3 seconds between when the truck became visible and the moment of impact, she had executed a series of steering and braking inputs that nearly avoided the collision entirely. A civilian driver would have frozen or made instinctive responses that would have resulted in a head-on collision. But Sarah's military training enabled her to minimize the impact angle and reduce the relative speed at the moment of contact. But even military training couldn't overcome the physics of a 2,800-pound Honda Civic colliding with an 80,000-pound semi-truck. The impact occurred at the driver's side door, crushing the passenger compartment and rendering the vehicle's safety systems ineffective. Sarah Martinez, the woman Millfield knew as a struggling single mother and gifted mechanic, was pronounced dead at the scene by emergency responders who arrived within 8 minutes of the collision. The truck driver survived with minor injuries, later testing positive for methamphetamines and caffeine levels that indicated dangerous stimulant abuse. But his survival and Sarah's death would trigger a cascade of revelations that would transform a tragic traffic accident into one of the most significant intelligence security breaches in modern American history. Chief Walsh was the first law enforcement officer to arrive at the accident scene, having been only 3 miles away when the collision was reported by multiple witnesses. His initial assessment was routine, tragic but straightforward case of a truck driver failing to observe traffic control devices, resulting in the death of a beloved community member. He began the standard procedures for traffic accident investigation, never suspecting that he was about to stumble into a situation that would require immediate federal intervention. The first anomaly occurred when Walsh attempted to access Sarah's vehicle to retrieve her personal belongings and notify next of kin. The Honda Civic's trunk contained what appeared to be routine automotive tools and emergency supplies. But buried beneath spare tire equipment was a locked metal case that felt too heavy for its size and bore markings that Walsh didn't recognize, but that suggested government property. The second anomaly was Sarah's purse, which contained 3 different driver's licenses in 3 different names, along with credit cards and identification documents that indicated multiple identities. The licenses were all genuine government documents, not the crude forgeries that Walsh might have expected to find if Sarah had been using false identification to evade creditors or an abusive ex-husband. The third anomaly was the most troubling: a cell phone that continued to ring with incoming calls every few minutes, displaying caller IDs that showed only numbers without names, text messages that contained what appeared to be coded communications, using terminology that Chief Walsh recognized as military jargon from his own service in the Ohio National Guard. By 12:30 p.m., less than an hour after the accident, Walsh had made the decision that would transform Millfield from a quiet Ohio town into the center of national media attention and federal investigation. He called the Ohio State Police and requested immediate assistance from federal authorities, explaining that he had discovered evidence suggesting that the victim might have connections to classified government activities. The federal response to Chief Walsh's call was swift and overwhelming in ways that confirmed his suspicions about Sarah's true identity. Within 90 minutes of his initial contact with state police, Millfield was occupied by agents from the FBI, Defense Intelligence Agency, and other federal agencies whose identities remained classified even after their activities became public knowledge. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez of the FBI's Columbus Field Office took charge of the local investigation, working to secure the accident scene while coordinating with military intelligence officers who were implementing protocols for managing the exposure of a deep cover operative. Agent Martinez's first priority was locating and securing any classified materials that might be stored at Sarah's residence or business. But her efforts were complicated by the need to maintain the fiction of routine accident investigation while actually conducting a national security operation. The breakthrough came when federal agents discovered a key in Sarah's personal effects that matched a safety deposit box at First National Bank of Millfield. Bank President Robert Chen, who had been awakened at home and escorted to the bank by federal agents, opened the vault to reveal a collection of documents that would rewrite everything Millfield thought it knew about their beloved neighbor and friend. The safety deposit box contained Sarah's real military identification, showing her rank as Colonel Sarah Elena Vasquez, United States Army Intelligence and Security Command. Her service record documented a career that included classified assignments throughout the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, with commendations and decorations that identified her as one of the military's most effective intelligence operatives. But the most shocking document in the safety deposit box was a letter addressed specifically to Chief Walsh and the people of Millfield, written in Sarah's familiar handwriting and dated just 3 weeks before her death. If you are reading this letter, then my cover has been compromised by circumstances beyond my control, and you are learning the truth about who I really am. I want you to know that everything you believed about my love for this community and my commitment to my daughters was absolutely true. The deception was necessary to protect not just my mission, but the safety of everyone in Millfield and the security of operations that have prevented attacks that could have cost thousands of American lives. I came to Millfield in 2018 as Colonel Sarah Elena Vasquez, signed to establish a deep cover intelligence operation that would monitor and disrupt terrorist activities throughout the Midwest. The abandoned auto shop provided perfect cover for a facility that has served as a regional command center for counterterrorism operations affecting 12 states. Over the past 6 years, intelligence gathered from this location has contributed to the prevention of 17 planned attacks on American soil, including plots targeting major cities, transportation infrastructure, and government facilities. The decision to maintain this operation while raising Emily and Sophia was the most difficult choice of my military career, but it was also the most important. My daughters needed stability and safety, and Millfield provided both, while allowing me to serve my country in ways that protected their future and the futures of millions of other children. Every day I spent fixing cars and attending soccer games was also a day spent analyzing intelligence that helped keep America safe from enemies you never knew existed. I hope you will understand that my deception was an act of love, not betrayal. I deceived you about my identity because I loved this community too much to put you at risk by revealing the truth. I served my country because I loved my daughters too much to leave them a world that was less safe than the one I found. And I maintained this double life because I believed that protecting innocence and preserving peace are worth any personal sacrifice. Take care of Emily and Sophia. They are the best of what America can be, and they deserve to grow up in the world we fought to preserve. Tell them their mother died serving something greater than herself, and that every choice I made was motivated by love for them and for the country that gave them the freedom to become whatever they choose to be. Colonel Sarah Elena Vasquez, United States Army Intelligence and Security Command. Serial number redacted. PS Chief Walsh. The hydraulic lift in the east bay of the garage can be activated using the code Emily-Sophia-1776. Single quotes what you find. Underneath will explain everything else you need to know about my real mission here. Protect my daughter's innocence as long as possible, but make sure they understand that their mother was proud to serve. Following Sarah's instructions, Chief Walsh and federal agents descended into what appeared to be the basement of Miller's Auto Repair, but was actually one of the most sophisticated intelligence facilities outside of the Pentagon itself. The hydraulic lift had been modified to serve as a freight elevator, providing access to a 3-level underground complex that extended 40 feet beneath the garage floor and contained technology that seemed to belong in a science fiction movie rather than a small-town auto shop. The first sublevel contained communication equipment that provided encrypted contact with military command centers throughout the world. Bank upon bank of computer servers analyzed intercepted communications, tracked suspicious financial transactions, and maintained databases of potential security threats throughout the region. Satellite uplinks disguised as automotive equipment provided real-time intelligence coordination with operatives on every continent. The second sublevel housed living quarters and emergency supplies that could support extended operations in case the facility needed to be sealed against external threats. The quarters included sleeping accommodations, food storage, medical supplies, and even a small library of children's books that suggested Sarah had prepared for the possibility that she might need to shelter Emily and Sophia in the underground facility during emergency situations. The third sublevel contained the most sensitive materials, classified intelligence files documenting 6 years of counterterrorism operations, detailed analyses of threats that had been neutralized through Sarah's work, and operational plans for ongoing missions that would need to be transferred to other facilities now that the Millfield operation had been compromised. Agent Martinez found herself reviewing intelligence summaries that read like a catalog of disasters that had been prevented through Sarah's efforts. A truck bomb plot targeting the Ohio State Fair had been disrupted when Sarah's network identified suspicious purchases of agricultural chemicals and timing devices. A planned attack on a Columbus synagogue had been prevented when her surveillance detected unusual communications patterns among known extremist cells. Most significantly, coordinated attack on Midwest transportation infrastructure had been stopped when Sarah's analysis revealed connections between seemingly unrelated activities in 6 different states. Colonel Vasquez's operation was directly responsible for saving thousands of lives. Agent Martinez would later tell congressional investigators her intelligence work prevented attacks that would have caused casualties comparable to major terrorist incidents. But because the attacks were prevented, rather than simply responded to, the American public never knew how close they came to experiencing catastrophic violence in their own communities. The discovery of Sarah's true identity created immediate concerns about the welfare of Emily and Sophia, who were staying with Margaret Thompson while their mother's body was being processed by the coroner's office. The girls had been told that their mother had died in a car accident, but they had not yet learned about the federal investigation or the revelation of her military identity. Federal agents found that Sarah had prepared extensively for this possibility, creating detailed plans for the girls' care and education that would provide them with stability, while protecting them from the media attention and security concerns that would inevitably result from their mother's exposure. Legal documents in the safety deposit box established trust funds that would provide for their education through college and beyond, funded by Sarah's military benefits and investment accounts that had been carefully managed throughout her years of service. More importantly, Sarah had prepared video messages for her daughters, recorded on their last birthday and stored in the underground facility, that explained her real identity and mission in terms that 8- and 10-year-old children could understand. The videos revealed a mother's love and a soldier's dedication, helping Emily and Sophia understand that their mother's deception had been an act of protection rather than betrayal. "Your mommy had 2 jobs," Sarah explained in the video message. "One job was taking care of you and fixing cars for our neighbors, which was the job you could see every day. The other job was keeping bad people from hurting good people, which was a secret job that I could never tell you about because secrets help keep everyone safe. Both jobs were important, but you were always the most important thing in my life. Everything I did was because I love you, and because I wanted you to grow up in a world where you could be safe and happy and free to become whatever you dream of being." The revelation of Sarah's true identity sent shockwaves through Millfield. that extended far beyond the immediate circle of people who had known her personally. Within hours of the federal agent's arrival, news crews from Columbus, Cincinnati, and Cleveland had descended on the town, transforming the quiet community into a media circus that overwhelmed local resources and infrastructure. Margaret Thompson, who had appointed herself as the unofficial spokesperson for people who had known Sarah personally, found herself fielding dozens of interview requests from reporters who wanted to understand how a military intelligence officer had successfully maintained a deep cover identity in such a small, close-knit community for 6 years. Her responses reflected the complex emotions that many residents were experiencing: pride in Sarah's service and sacrifice, grief for their loss, and amazement at the scope of the deception that had fooled them all. "I keep thinking about all those conversations we had," Margaret told a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch. "Sarah would ask me about local families, about who was having financial troubles or relationship problems, about changes in the community that I thought were important. I thought she was just being a good neighbor, trying to understand the people she was serving as a business owner. Now I realized she was gathering intelligence about potential security vulnerabilities, making sure that none of our local problems were being exploited by people who might want to hurt us." The Rodriguez family struggled with similar mixed emotions, remembering how Sarah had helped their daughter, Rosa, with homework and had volunteered to provide free automotive repairs for immigrant families who were struggling financially. "She was protecting us in ways we never knew we needed protection," Elena Rodriguez observed. "When that man came looking for her a few years ago, claiming to be her husband, she handled it in a way that kept all of us safe. Now I understand that she knew how to deal with dangerous people because that was her real job." Police Chief Walsh found himself at the center of a media storm that challenged his understanding of his own effectiveness as a law enforcement officer. Reporters wanted to know how he had failed to detect the presence of a major federal intelligence operation in his jurisdiction. But Walsh's response reflected a more nuanced understanding of the situation. Sarah Martinez, Colonel Vasquez, was protecting this community every day for 6 years. Walsh explained to a CNN correspondent, "My job was to keep Millfield safe from crime and disorder, and during those 6 years, we had some of the lowest crime rates in our history. I thought that was because we were doing good police work. But now I understand that we had help from someone who was watching for threats that I never would have recognized. She wasn't undermining local law enforcement, she was making it more effective by handling problems that were beyond our capabilities." The exposure of Sarah's operation created significant challenges for military intelligence planners who had to rapidly reorganize counterterrorism operations throughout the Midwest. While managing the security implications of having a deep cover facility compromised through accidental exposure, Congressional Intelligence Oversight Committees demanded briefings on the scope of domestic intelligence operations, while military leaders worked to ensure that ongoing missions would not be compromised by the revelation of Sarah's identity and methods. General Patricia Williams, director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, testified before a closed session of the Senate Intelligence Committee that Colonel Vasquez's operation had been one of the most effective counterterrorism initiatives in American history, directly responsible for preventing attacks that could have resulted in casualties exceeding those of September 11, 2001. The general's testimony, later declassified in heavily redacted form, revealed that Sarah's work had contributed to intelligence operations on every continent and had provided crucial information for military planning and diplomatic negotiations with allied nations. Colonel Vasquez demonstrated that effective intelligence work requires more than advanced technology and sophisticated analysis, General Williams explained. It requires understanding the communities you're protecting, integrating yourself into the social fabric in ways that allow you to detect threats before they mature into active plots. Her success in Millfield provides a model for intelligence operations that protect American communities while preserving the trust and cooperation that are essential for maintaining democratic values. The operational security implications of Sarah's exposure led to immediate changes in how the military conducted domestic intelligence operations, with new protocols for protecting deep cover operatives and enhanced procedures for managing accidental compromise of classified missions. But intelligence officials also recognized that Sarah's success had demonstrated the value of long-term community integration as a counterterrorism strategy. 6 months after Sarah's death, Millfield had been transformed from an obscure Ohio town into a symbol of hidden heroism and silent service that attracted visitors from around the world. The auto shop where Sarah had conducted her double life had been preserved as a memorial and educational facility, with the underground complex converted into a museum that provided public education about counterterrorism operations while protecting classified details of ongoing missions. Emily and Sophia Martinez had been placed in the care of Margaret Thompson, who had volunteered to serve as their guardian while they completed their education in Millfield. The girls' trust funds provided resources for private tutoring and enrichment programs that would prepare them for whatever futures they chose to pursue. But they had expressed their intention to remain in the community that had embraced their mother and provided them with the stability she had sought when she chose Millfield as the base for her operations. The Colonel Sarah Elena Vasquez Memorial Foundation, established with donations from around the country, provided scholarships for children of military families and funded community development projects in small towns that faced economic challenges similar to those that had affected Millfield. The Foundation's mission statement reflected Sarah's belief that protecting America required strengthening the communities where American values were lived and preserved. Colonel Vasquez understood that national security is not just about defeating foreign enemies, the Foundation's mission statement declared. It's about preserving the way of life that makes America worth defending. Her legacy reminds us that heroes often work in silence, that the greatest service requires the greatest sacrifice, and that protecting innocence is the highest calling of those who serve in uniform. The auto shop's hydraulic lift, which had concealed the entrance to one of America's most important intelligence facilities, became a symbol of the hidden depths that exist beneath the surface of ordinary American life. Tour groups would stand in the garage where Sarah had fixed cars for 6 years while conducting intelligence operations that had global implications, marveling at the ordinariness of the setting that had concealed such extraordinary activities. But for the people of Millfield, the most important legacy was the continued presence of Emily and Sophia, 2 remarkable young women whose mother had demonstrated that serving your country and loving your family were not competing obligations, but complementary commitments that could make both service and love more meaningful. The girls' academic achievements, their kindness to neighbors, and their pride in their mother's sacrifice reminded the community every day that heroes are not defined by the recognition they receive, but by the love that motivates their service. As Margaret Thompson would tell visitors who came to understand Sarah's story, she was exactly who we thought she was, a devoted mother, a skilled professional, and a caring neighbor who made our community better by being part of it. The fact that she was also a decorated military officer conducting classified operations just made her more of who she already was, not someone different. Love doesn't become less real when you discover it was even greater than you imagined. The contents of that safety deposit box had revealed the most extraordinary story in Millfield's history, but they had also confirmed the most ordinary truth, that Sarah Martinez had been exactly the person her neighbors had loved and admired, just with responsibilities and capabilities that none of them had been able to imagine. Her legacy would live on in the daughters she had raised, community she had protected, the nation she had served with a dedication that required no audience and sought no recognition beyond the knowledge that her sacrifice had made the world safer for the people she loved most. In the end, Sarah's story became a reminder that heroism often wears work clothes, that sacrifice is most meaningful when it is invisible, and that the greatest service to country is often indistinguishable. From the greatest love for family, the woman who had died in a tragic accident while rushing to pick up her daughter from soccer practice had actually died as she had lived, serving something greater than herself, while never forgetting that love, not duty, was the source of her strength and the measure of her success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.